The year was 505 of the Common Era, and in the sprawling metropolis of Constantinople, a child named Theodora was about to discover that innocence was a luxury the poor could never afford. Born into the lowest echelons of Byzantine society, she entered a world where survival demanded sacrifices that would hollow out her soul and forge something far more dangerous than any emperor had ever imagined. Her father Acacius worked as a bear keeper for the Green faction at the Hippodrome, one of the most brutal and unforgiving occupations in the empire. When he died suddenly, leaving behind a widow and 3 young daughters, the family faced immediate destitution. Theodora's mother, desperate beyond measure, made a decision that would echo through the corridors of imperial power for decades to come. She dressed her daughters in the finest clothes they owned, pathetic rags by aristocratic standards but the best their poverty could provide, and led them into the arena during a public gathering. The plan was simple and heartbreaking. The mother would beg the Green faction leaders to grant her late husband's position to someone who would support her family. But the Greens, drunk on their own power and indifferent to the suffering of those beneath them, rejected her plea with casual cruelty. They laughed as she wept, dismissed her children as worthless, and turned their backs on the family's desperation. What happened next would plant the first seeds of a vengeance that would eventually consume thousands. The Blue faction, rivals to the Greens, saw an opportunity in this public humiliation. They offered to help the family, not out of compassion, but because supporting the widow would be a visible insult to their competitors. Young Theodora, barely 5 years old, watched with eyes that were already learning to calculate advantage and betrayal. She saw how power worked, how mercy was weakness, and how those who showed vulnerability were inevitably crushed. The Blues provided her father's replacement, but their charity came with a price that became clear as the months passed. Theodora and her sisters were expected to perform for the faction's entertainment. What began as innocent dancing and simple theatrical presentations gradually transformed into something far more sinister. The faction leaders, men whose names Theodora would memorize with the precision of a scholar studying sacred texts, began to demand increasingly degrading performances. By age 7, Theodora was no longer a child in any meaningful sense. The men who controlled her family's survival had systematically stripped away every protection that childhood should have provided. Marcus Demetrius, a Blue faction leader with dead eyes and hands that lingered too long during their so-called training sessions, was the first to cross lines that should never have been crossed. He justified his actions with the cold logic of ownership, reminding Theodora that her family's bread depended entirely on his continued satisfaction with her performances. The training sessions took place in the bowels of the Hippodrome, in chambers that reeked of sweat, fear, and something darker that Theodora would not have words for until years later. Demetrius and his associates, including a particularly vicious man named Antonius Flavius and another called Sergius the Tall, developed what they called educational programs for their young performers. These sessions were designed with the methodical precision of military campaigns, each one calculated to break down another barrier, to push the children further into a world where their bodies and dignity were commodities to be traded. The psychological manipulation was perhaps even more devastating than the physical abuse. The men created an elaborate system of rewards and punishments that kept the children constantly off balance, never certain whether compliance would bring relief or simply escalate the demands. Theodora learned that crying brought harsher treatment, that resistance resulted in her sisters facing consequences, and that the only path to relative safety lay in becoming exactly what these monsters wanted her to become. But something unexpected happened during those years of systematic brutalization. Instead of breaking completely, Theodora began to develop a different kind of strength. She started to study her abusers with the intensity of a general analyzing enemy forces. She memorized their faces, their voices, their particular cruelties and weaknesses. She noted which men were married, which had children of their own, which held positions of respect in Constantinople's social hierarchy. Every detail was catalogued and stored away in a mind that was learning to think like a weapon. Marcus Demetrius had a distinctive scar above his left eyebrow and a habit of humming hymns while he violated children. Antonius Flavius wore expensive rings that left marks when he struck his victims, and he always smelled of imported perfumes that couldn't quite mask the stench of his soul. Sergius the Tall had a nervous laugh and a tendency to quote classical poetry during his worst moments, as if literary references could somehow ennoble his monstrous acts. These men and dozens of others became the cast of characters in a play that existed only in Theodora's mind, a drama where she was both victim and future director. She began to understand that her current powerlessness was temporary. That knowledge was a form of currency that could be accumulated and eventually spent. Every humiliation, every violation, every moment of helpless rage was transformed into fuel for something that would eventually burn through the empire like wildfire. The public performances in the Hippodrome were their own form of torture, designed to strip away the last vestiges of dignity and self-respect. Theodora and other children were paraded before crowds of thousands, forced to participate in increasingly explicit theatrical presentations that blurred the line between entertainment and exploitation. The audience, composed of citizens from every level of Byzantine society, watched with a mixture of arousal and disgust that perfectly captured the empire's moral bankruptcy. During one particularly degrading performance, when Theodora was perhaps 9 years old, she caught sight of a young man in the imperial box who seemed different from the usual collection of bored aristocrats and leering merchants. He was watching her with what appeared to be genuine sympathy rather than predatory interest. This was her first glimpse of Justinian, though she would not learn his name for several more years. That moment of human connection, brief as it was, became a lifeline that helped her maintain some fragment of hope during the darkest periods of her childhood. The faction leaders delighted in psychological games that went far beyond simple abuse. They would force the children to compete against each other for basic necessities, creating artificial scarcities that turned potential allies into rivals. Food, clean clothing, and even sleeping arrangements became prizes to be won through increasingly degrading competitions. The adults orchestrating these contests understood that breaking bonds between victims was essential for maintaining control. Theodora learned to navigate this landscape with a cunning that impressed and terrified her handlers. She discovered how to manipulate the system just enough to protect her sisters without appearing to challenge the authority of their captors. When Comedo, her older sister, was selected for particularly brutal treatment, Theodora found ways to redirect that attention to herself. When Anastasia, the youngest, showed signs of complete psychological collapse, Theodora became a shield between her sister and the worst of their reality. But protection came at a cost that compounded daily. Each time Theodora absorbed punishment meant for others, each time she submitted to degradation to spare her sisters, another piece of her capacity for mercy died. The men who controlled her life began to recognize that they had created something unique in this particular child. Unlike other victims, who either broke completely or maintained some core of innocence, Theodora was transforming into something that mirrored their own darkness. Marcus Demetrius, in a moment of drunken honesty that he would later regret, told his associates that watching Theodora evolve was like observing a master craftsman at work. She was learning their techniques, absorbing their methods, and developing an understanding of power dynamics that reveled their own. What he failed to recognize was that she was also planning their destruction with the same methodical precision they had used to destroy her childhood. The turning point came during Theodora's 13th year, when the faction leaders decided to expand their operations beyond the relatively private confines of the Hippodrome's underground chambers. They began renting out their trained performers to private parties hosted by Constantinople's elite, events where the children would provide entertainment that pushed the boundaries of legality and human decency. At one such gathering, hosted by a wealthy senator named Hypatius in his luxurious villa overlooking the Bosphorus, Theodora found herself performing for an audience that included several men who would later hold positions of tremendous power in Justinian's government. She memorized every face, every name, every detail of their behavior during that evening. Years later, when she possessed the authority to destroy lives with a word, these memories would prove invaluable. The senator's party was attended by Tribonian, who would eventually serve as Justinian's chief legal advisor, and John the Cappadocian. destined to become one of the most powerful and corrupt officials in the empire. Both men participated enthusiastically in the evening's entertainment, their actions providing Theodora with leverage that would prove useful when she needed to bend the imperial government to her will. But it was during this same period that Theodora began to develop the skills that would eventually elevate her far above her origins. The constant performance requirements had given her an actor's understanding of human psychology, an ability to read emotions and motivations that went far beyond her years. The need to manipulate her captors for survival had taught her lessons about power and influence that no formal education could have provided. She learned to become whatever each situation required. For Marcus Demetrius, she became the eager student, hanging on his every word and seeming to worship his authority. For Antonius Flavius, she played the role of the broken victim, providing him with the sense of complete dominance that fed his particular pathology. For Sergius the Tall, she became the intellectual companion, engaging with his literary pretensions and making him feel sophisticated rather than simply monstrous. Each performance was calculated to provide her with advantages, however small. Information about faction politics, gossip about imperial court intrigues, details about the personal lives and vulnerabilities of powerful men. All of this intelligence was gathered and stored away for future use. Theodora was building an arsenal of secrets that would eventually prove more valuable than any military force. The other children in their situation rarely survived to adulthood, either dying from the physical abuse, succumbing to diseases born of malnutrition and neglect, or simply losing their minds under the constant psychological pressure. Those who did survive typically emerged as broken shells, capable of little more than basic survival. Theodora was evolving into something entirely different, a predator disguised as prey, a future empress learning statecraft in the most brutal school imaginable. Her education in manipulation reached new heights when she discovered that several of her abusers were vulnerable to blackmail. Marcus Demetrius, despite his public persona as a devout Christian and family man, had particular tastes that would have scandalized even Constantinople's jaded population. Antonius Flavius was embezzling funds from the Blue faction's treasury to support gambling debts that threatened to destroy his career. Sergius the Tall was conducting an affair with the wife of a prominent general, a relationship that could have resulted in his execution if discovered. Theodora began to test the waters carefully, dropping hints that she possessed dangerous knowledge, making subtle suggestions about the value of treating her with greater consideration. The men who had once viewed her as completely powerless began to recognize that she had developed teeth, and some of them started to fear the monster they had created. This newfound leverage allowed her to negotiate better conditions for her sisters and herself, but it also escalated the danger they faced. The faction leaders realized that Theodora knew too much to be safely released, but they also understood that she had become too dangerous to handle carelessly. They began planning to eliminate her permanently, a decision that would prove to be the greatest mistake of their lives. Word of the planned assassination reached Theodora through a network of informants she had cultivated among the hippodrome's servants and minor functionaries. These were people who, like herself, had been ignored and dismissed by their social superiors, and who had learned to find power in information and alliance. The underground community of the powerless had recognized in Theodora someone who might eventually be able to strike back at their oppressors. The night before the planned murder, Theodora made her escape from the faction's control, but not before ensuring that her departure would be remembered. She set fire to Marcus Demetrius's private chambers, destroying not only his personal belongings, but also records that documented the full extent of the faction's criminal activities. The blaze spread to neighboring structures, causing damage that cost the Blues a fortune and brought unwanted official attention to their operations. More importantly, she stole a collection of documents that Demetrius had been using to blackmail various officials and aristocrats. These papers contained evidence of corruption, sexual misconduct, and political treachery that reached into the highest levels of Byzantine society. Armed with this intelligence, 15-year-old Theodora stepped into the wider world of Constantinople with weapons that could destroy careers and lives. Her years of systematic abuse had ended, but the education they provided would shape every decision she made for the rest of her life. She had learned that mercy was a luxury that led to victimization, that trust was a weakness to be exploited, and that power was the only reliable protection against those who would do harm. Most importantly, she had developed an understanding of human nature that would serve her well in the treacherous world of imperial politics. The child who had entered the Hippodrome's underground chambers as an innocent victim had emerged as something far more dangerous. She possessed detailed knowledge of the weaknesses and crimes of dozens of powerful men. She understood the mechanics of manipulation and control better than most professional politicians, and she had developed an absolute commitment to ensuring that those who had harmed her would eventually pay a price that matched their crimes. As Theodora began her new life as a free woman in Constantinople, she carried with her the faces and names of every person who had participated in her degradation. Marcus Demetrius, Antonius Flavius, Sergius the Tall, and dozens of others had no idea that their former victim was now plotting their destruction with the same methodical precision. They had once used to break her spirit. They had created their own nemesis, and the reckoning they faced would be more terrible than anything they had ever inflicted on others. The transformation from victim to predator was complete, but Theodora's story was just beginning. The skills she had learned in hell would soon elevate her to heights of power that her former captors could never have imagined. And when she finally possessed the authority to settle old scores, the blood that flowed would wash away not just her tormentors, but thousands of innocent people who had the misfortune to be in the wrong place when an empress decided to demonstrate the true meaning of imperial wrath. The mathematics of revenge were about to be calculated on a scale that would shock even the Byzantine Empire, a civilization already well acquainted with cruelty and excess. Theodora had learned her lessons well, perhaps too well, and the teachers who had shaped her were about to discover that some students eventually surpass their instructors in ways that destroy everything they once thought they controlled. Her rise to ultimate power began with a calculated decision to leverage her hard-won knowledge of Constantinople's elite into a position of influence that would eventually catch the attention of the future emperor himself. Theodora understood that her collection of stolen documents and accumulated secrets represented a form of currency that could be spent strategically to build the foundation of a new life, one where she would never again be vulnerable to the predations of those who mistook powerlessness for worthlessness. The young woman who emerged from years of systematic abuse possessed advantages that few people in her position could claim. Her forced education in the darkest aspects of human nature had given her insights into the motivations and weaknesses of the powerful that most courtiers spent decades trying to acquire. She could read the subtle signs of corruption, manipulation, and hidden vice with the expertise of someone who had been both victim and student of these arts. More importantly, she had developed an absolute commitment to the acquisition and maintenance of power as the only reliable protection against those who would exploit the vulnerable. Every decision she made was filtered through the lens of strategic advantage, every relationship evaluated for its potential to advance her position or eliminate threats to her security. The capacity for trust, mercy, and forgiveness that might have made her a better person had been systematically destroyed by her experiences, replaced by a calculating intelligence that would serve her well in the treacherous world of Byzantine politics. Her first strategic move was to establish herself as an independent performer in Constantinople's entertainment district, using her skills and knowledge to attract the attention of wealthy patrons who could provide both financial support and political connections. But unlike her previous situation, she now controlled the terms of these relationships, wielding her accumulated secrets like weapons to ensure that no one could again reduce her to the status of helpless victim. The documents she had stolen from Marcus Demetrius proved to be even more valuable than she had initially realized. They contained evidence linking several prominent senators to a conspiracy against the previous emperor, information that could be used to destroy careers or, more profitably, to secure the loyalty and support of those who feared exposure. Theodora began to build a network of allies and debtors, people who owed their continued prosperity and freedom to her discretion and protection. Among her early conquests was Hypatius, the senator whose villa had hosted one of the most degrading performances of her childhood. Now a man of advancing years and diminishing political influence, he found himself confronted by a young woman who possessed detailed knowledge of his participation in activities that would have scandalized even Constantinople's jaded society. Rather than destroy him immediately, Theodora chose to cultivate him as a source of information and influence, demonstrating the strategic thinking that would eventually make her one of the most formidable political operators in the empire. Through Hypatius and others like him, Theodora gained access to the social circles that surrounded the imperial court. She began to appear at gatherings where policy was discussed and alliances formed, always presenting herself as a charming and intelligent companion. Rather than the dangerous predator she had become, her ability to adapt her persona to match the expectations and desires of her targets made her extraordinarily effective at gathering intelligence and building relationships that served her long-term objectives. It was during this period of careful social climbing that she first encountered Justinian in a context that allowed for actual conversation rather than the distant glimpse she had caught during her childhood performances. The future emperor was immediately struck by her intelligence and sophistication, qualities that seemed remarkable in someone from such humble origins. What he could not have known was that her education had been far more comprehensive and brutal than anything provided by the empire's finest tutors. Justinian, himself a man of humble origins who had risen to prominence through a combination of intelligence, ambition, and his uncle's patronage, recognized in Theodora a kindred spirit who understood the mechanics of power and advancement. Their initial conversations revealed a meeting of minds that transcended the usual superficial attractions but characterized most relationships between powerful men and beautiful women in Byzantine society. But Theodora's interest in Justinian was not merely romantic or even primarily focused on the obvious advantages that a relationship with him would provide. She recognized in him someone who possessed both the vision and the ruthlessness necessary to reshape the empire according to principles that would serve her own objectives. More importantly, she understood that his rise to ultimate power was virtually inevitable, given his position as heir to his uncle's throne and his demonstrated competence in both military and administrative matters. The courtship that developed between them was unlike anything either had previously experienced. Justinian found in Theodora an intellectual equal who could discuss theology, law, and politics with a sophistication that rivaled the empire's most educated aristocrats. Theodora discovered in Justinian someone whose ambitions were large enough to provide the platform she needed to settle accounts with those who had wronged her while building a legacy that would ensure her permanent security. Their relationship scandalized Constantinople's elite, who could not understand how the heir to the imperial throne could seriously consider marrying someone from such disreputable origins. The opposition to their union came from multiple sources: aristocrats who viewed Theodora's elevation as a threat to the established social order, church officials who were horrified by her past as a performer, and political rivals who recognized that her intelligence and ruthlessness would make her a formidable opponent once she gained access to imperial power. The legal obstacles to their marriage seemed insurmountable, as existing laws prohibited unions between members of the imperial family and women who had worked as performers. But Justinian's uncle, the Emperor Justin I, was eventually persuaded to change these laws, partly out of affection for his nephew and partly because he had come to appreciate Theodora's political acumen and the advantages her support would bring to the dynasty. The wedding of Justinian and Theodora in 525 was both a celebration and a warning to those who had underestimated the former performer's capacity for advancement. The ceremony itself was a masterpiece of political theater, designed to establish Theodora's legitimacy while subtly threatening those who might challenge her new position. Among the guests were several men who had participated in her childhood abuse, now forced to bow before the woman they had once treated as property. Marcus Demetrius, Antonius Flavius, and Sergius the Tall were all present at the wedding, their faces carefully composed to hide the terror they must have felt as they watched their former victim ascend to a position where she could destroy them with a word. Theodora's behavior toward them was perfectly correct, even gracious, but those who knew her history could see the promise of future retribution in her eyes. The early years of her marriage to Justinian were marked by a careful consolidation of power and influence that prepared the ground for the eventual settling of old scores. Theodora established herself as more than just the emperor's wife. She became his closest advisor and most trusted political ally, someone whose judgment he valued above that of his official counselors and military commanders. Her influence over imperial policy was exercised through a combination of formal and informal channels that made her one of the most powerful people in the Byzantine Empire, even before Justinian's accession to the throne. She cultivated relationships with key military commanders, church officials, and administrative personnel, building a network of loyalty that would serve her well when the time came to implement her plans for revenge. The death of Justin I in 527 brought Justinian to the throne and elevated Theodora to the position of empress, giving her access to the full resources of the imperial government. Her coronation was attended by many of the same people who had witnessed her degradation as a child, creating a symmetry that must have provided her with considerable satisfaction even as she began planning their destruction. As empress, Theodora demonstrated a level of political sophistication that impressed even her critics. She involved herself in theological disputes, military planning, and administrative reform with an expertise that suggested years of careful study and preparation. But beneath this veneer of imperial competence, she was methodically identifying and cataloging every person who had participated in or benefited from her childhood abuse. The intelligence network she had begun building during her years as an independent performer was expanded and professionalized, becoming one of the most effective information-gathering operations in the empire's history. Through this network, she tracked the current positions and activities of her former tormentors, noting their weaknesses, their families, their financial situations, and their political vulnerabilities. Marcus Demetrius had used his connections within the Blue faction to establish himself as a successful merchant, trading in luxury goods imported from the far reaches of the empire. His wealth had allowed him to purchase a villa in one of Constantinople's most fashionable districts, where he lived with a wife and 3 children who had no knowledge of his past activities. Antonius Flavius had parlayed his faction connections into a position within the imperial bureaucracy, where he was responsible for managing tax collection in several wealthy provinces. Sergius the Tall had married into an aristocratic family and was serving as a military commander on the empire's eastern frontier. All of these men, and dozens of others who had participated in the systematic abuse of Theodora and her fellow victims, had built successful lives on the foundation of their crimes, never imagining that their past would eventually catch up with them. They had dismissed their former victims as powerless and forgettable, people whose suffering was irrelevant to their own advancement and prosperity. But Theodora had not forgotten, and she had not forgiven. Every slight, every violation, every moment of helpless rage had been preserved in her memory with perfect clarity, waiting for the day when she would possess the power to exact a price that matched the magnitude of their crimes. The reckoning she planned would not be swift or merciful. It would be as systematic and methodical as the abuse she had endured, designed to maximize suffering while demonstrating the consequences of underestimating someone they had treated as less than human. The opportunity for revenge came sooner than even Theodora might have expected, arriving in the form of the Nika Riots of 532, a popular uprising that would provide the perfect cover for settling old scores while simultaneously demonstrating her value to Justinian as a political partner capable of making the hard decisions that effective governance sometimes required.